January 3, 1944. Rabaul Harbor, New Britain. 20,000 feet below a formation of American fighters, the water is flat and gray under the morning haze. Major Gregory Boyington noses his Corsair down toward 10 Japanese Zeros, his wingman George Ashman tucked in tight on his wing. This is Boyington's last scheduled combat mission of the tour, the one that closes out 4 months over the Solomons and Rabaul, and by the time it's over he has led his squadron to more confirmed kills than any Marine unit in the Pacific War. He rolls in, fires, and watches the first Zero fall away trailing smoke. 2 more go down in the same pass. Then, from above, more Japanese fighters arrive, roughly 20 of them, dropping out of the sun onto 2 American planes that have just spent their altitude advantage killing 3 of their own. In the next 90 seconds, one of the best fighter pilots the Marine Corps ever produced is going to disappear over the Pacific, and the United States government will spend the next 20 months not knowing whether he is alive. This is how a fighter built for a job the Navy said it couldn't do carried him into that fight, and how it ended. By the time the Corsair arrived in the Solomons in early 1943, American pilots already knew exactly what the Mitsubishi Zero could do to anyone who fought it on its own terms. Stripped of armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks to save every possible pound, the Zero could outturn almost any fighter in the sky, climbing and banking with a lightness no American design could match. Marine and Navy pilots at Guadalcanal in 1942 had already paid for the lesson in Grumman Wildcats too slow and too heavy to win a turning fight, watching squadron mates die trying to outmaneuver an airplane that simply outmaneuvered everything. The doctrine that survived that campaign was blunt. Never turn with a Zero, use altitude and speed instead, dive, shoot, and climb away before the fight could turn into the kind the Japanese pilot wanted. What the Marine Corps needed was a fighter fast enough and strong enough to fly that doctrine and win it every time. The airplane that answered that requirement had already been flying for 3 years, rejected by the service that built it for the one job everyone assumed a Navy fighter needed to do, and it reached the front only months before Boyington did, flying its first combat over Bougainville in February 1943 with a Marine squadron that had barely learned the airplane's habits before they were fighting in it. The Vought F4U Corsair began as a straightforward, brutal piece of engineering logic. Take the most powerful aircraft engine in American production, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, and build the smallest possible airframe around it. The engine alone produced 2,000 horsepower, enough to need a propeller nearly 13 feet across, and that propeller created a problem. Mounted on a conventional straight wing, the landing gear legs needed to hold it clear of the runway would have been absurdly long and structurally weak. Vought's solution was the inverted gull wing that gave the Corsair its silhouette, bending down and out from the fuselage so the main gear could mount at the low point of the wing on legs short enough to be strong. The prototype first flew on May 29, 1940, and by the end of that year it had already touched 404 miles an hour, faster than any fighter the United States had in the air. The production F4U-1 that reached squadrons in October 1942 carried 650 caliber machine guns, could reach 417 miles an hour at 19,000 feet, climbed at nearly 2,900 feet a minute, and had a service ceiling above 36,000 feet. Against the Zero it was faster in level flight, faster in the climb, and faster in the dive, exactly the numbers the boom and zoom doctrine needed. None of that mattered to the Navy's Carrier Qualification Board. In the fall of 1942, testing the Corsair aboard the escort carrier USS Sangamon in Chesapeake Bay, Lieutenant Commander Sam Porter found an airplane that was close to unlandable on a flight deck. The long nose housing that huge engine blocked the pilot's forward view on final approach, so badly that the landing signal officer often couldn't be seen at all. The main gear was stiff enough to bounce the aircraft back into the air on touchdown, and at low approach speed the left wing had a habit of stalling and dropping without warning, a fault that could flip a Corsair into the sea beside the carrier. The Navy rejected it for fleet service. The fixes that eventually solved the problem, a stall strip on the wing leading edge and a curved approach pattern that kept the runway in the pilot side window instead of straight ahead, wouldn't be adopted until British Fleet Air Arm Squadrons worked them out flying Corsairs off Royal Navy carriers in 1944. Until then, the airplane that could outclimb and outdive a Zero had nowhere to land at sea. So the Marine Corps took it instead and flew it from the only runways available in the Solomons. Strips of coral and steel matting cut out of the jungle, close enough to the fighting that a fighter that couldn't land on a carrier didn't need to. Gregory Boyington was not the Marine Corps' obvious choice to lead a new squadron in the summer of 1943. He had already resigned his commission once, in 1941, to fly for Claire Chennault's American volunteer group in China, the Flying Tigers, where he claimed 6 Japanese aircraft against a unit record that only confirmed about 2. He rejoined the Marines in 1942, 30 years old, a hard drinker with a service record that had already cost him 1 promotion. In August 1943, on the island of Espiritu Santo, he was handed 27 pilots with no assigned squadron, leftovers and replacements pulled together into a unit that didn't exist yet. He built them into Marine Fighting Squadron 214. The pilots, aware of exactly how their squadron had been scraped together, named themselves the Black Sheep. They flew their first combat from the Southern Solomons that September, moving forward to the airstrip at Vella Lavella as the front pushed north toward Bougainville and Rabaul beyond it. On September 16, 1943, Boyington led a formation of Corsairs escorting dive bombers toward the Japanese base at Rabaul when roughly 40 Zeros jumped the formation. Boyington shot down 5 of them in that single fight, an ace in a day, then found himself with no fuel left to get home and put his Corsair down dead stick, engine off on the strip at Munda. Over the following months, the Black Sheep flew fighter sweeps deep into the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific, the ring of 5 airfields around Rabaul that the Japanese had turned into their main southern bastion. By the end of the tour, the squadron was credited with 94 enemy aircraft destroyed and had produced 9 aces, Boyington among them, at a cost of nearly 40% of its pilots killed or missing. If you're enjoying how a rejected carrier fighter turned into the best fighter the Marines had in the Pacific, a subscribe helps this channel find more people who want their air combat history done properly, and there's no better place to see the doctrine actually work than the mission that ended Boyington's tour. By January 1944, Rabaul had been pounded by Allied air power for months, its harbor and airfields the target of near-constant fighter sweeps and bomber raids meant to grind the base into uselessness ahead of an invasion that, in the end, would never come. Carrier aircraft from USS Bunker Hill and the rest of Task Force 38 had already hit the anchorage directly in November 1943. Shooting Japanese aircraft out of the sky over the harbor in daylight raids meant to cripple the base before it could threaten the American landings then underway at Bougainville. The Japanese had reinforced with fresh naval air groups sent down from Truk and Singapore, pushing local strength back up toward roughly 300 aircraft, but the pilots flying them were more and more inexperienced replacements. The veteran cadre that had flown at Pearl Harbor and Midway 2 years earlier was mostly dead, and Allied fighter sweeps through the first weeks of January kept grinding down whatever came up to meet them, Rabaul's operational aircraft falling toward roughly 100 machines by the middle of the month. On the morning of January 3rd, Boyington led one of those sweeps, a large formation numbering around 48 American fighters in total, against the airfields ringing the harbor. Over the target, he and his wingman George Ashman spotted about 10 Zeros below them and dove to attack. Boyington claimed 3 destroyed in the first pass, a hard, fast, textbook execution of everything the Corsair was built to do. Then the Japanese answer arrived from above, close to 20 more Zeros, diving out of the sun onto 2 American fighters that had just burned their altitude advantage, killing the first 3. Boyington shot down 1 more Zero trying to cover his wingman, a kill that would later become the most argued number in his entire record. Ashman's Corsair took hits and went down into the water. He did not survive. Boyington's own aircraft caught fire, and he bailed out over Rabaul Harbor, wounded, burned, and strafed by a Japanese fighter as he hung in his parachute. He spent hours in the water before he was picked up, not by the American submarine he was hoping to see surface beside him, but by the Japanese submarine I-181, which carried him to Rabaul as a prisoner. For the rest of the war, the United States did not know if Gregory Boyington was alive. The Marine Corps had already recommended him for the Medal of Honor before the mission that took him down, covering his actions from September 12, 1943 through January 3, 1944, and the award went forward with his fate unknown, accepted on his behalf by his mother in a ceremony that treated him, in everything but official language, as dead. His final tally, the number that made him for a time the top-scoring American ace of the war, is usually given as 28, 22 credited during his Marine Corps tour plus the 6 he claimed in China, a total that would have passed Eddie Rickenbacker's American record from the First World War. Contemporary Flying Tiger records only confirm about 2 of those Chinese victories, and depending on which count a historian trusts, Boyington's real total sits anywhere from the low 20s to 28. The uncertainty was never resolved by combat, because his last kill, like the man himself, simply vanished off the record for 20 months. Boyington was moved through Japanese custody toward the home islands, and from March 1944 he was held at Ofuna, a secret naval interrogation camp near Yokosuka, where prisoners were deliberately kept off the Red Cross rolls, unregistered and unreported. He survived the beatings and starvation that defined that camp, was later shown a press clipping describing his own presumed death and posthumous medal, and remained a prisoner until Japan's surrender. He was released from a camp near Tokyo on August 29, 1945, 20 months after the mission that was supposed to end his combat tour cleanly. On October 5, 1945, President Harry Truman presented him the Medal of Honor in person, the medal his mother had already accepted once believing he was gone. VMF 214 flew on without him. Command passed to another Black Sheep officer, and the squadron kept flying sweeps against Rabaul through January and February 1944 as the Rabaul Air Campaign finished the job it had started, stripping the base of any real ability to threaten the Allied advance. Rabaul itself was never invaded. Allied planners judged the cost of storming its garrison too high and simply went around it, leaving something close to 100,000 Japanese troops cut off on New Britain and New Ireland for the rest of the war, supplied by submarine, starving in a jungle they could no longer fly or sail out of. The strategy that Boyington's last mission had been one small part of worked exactly as intended. It simply worked without him there to see it finish. The Corsair that the Navy wouldn't put on its own carriers went on to fly from them anyway, once the fixes the British had already found were adopted, and stayed in frontline American service for another decade, still flying combat missions over Korea. Vella, Lavella, and Munda, the coral strips where Boyington ran his squadron on fumes and nerve, are quiet now, grown back over with jungle, the runways barely visible from the air. Rabaul's harbor, where he went into the water in January 1944, is still ringed by the volcanic hills the Black Sheep pilots used to navigate by, unchanged since the morning a wingman went down beside him and a fighter that was never supposed to see combat from a ship's deck carried the most famous Marine pilot in the Pacific straight into the one fight he could not fly out of.